We're going to start off with pretty much the most fundamental movement we can possibly use when passing the guard. And really all that is me moving laterally. I'm pushing off my outside leg and I'm looking to circle to either side of Chris. Now I don't want to get in a situation where I'm just spinning around in circles and he's moving with me, although it kind of happens like that. I'm going to begin by framing his knees. And again, Chris is not able to attack me at all. He's only able to frame. That's the constraint in this game. He can only frame and move. So I frame his knees and I distribute my weight such that I'm not going to fall if he moves unpredictably. So like if I lean all my weight into him and he starts moving, like I might lose my balance and fall over. So I want to lean into him in a way that it's really effective for me to use the weight of gravity, like the weight of my body, to manipulate his body. So I'm leaning into him enough so it's really efficient for me to move him around. I start moving to one side. Chris is going to start angling his hips. So you can see as I move to the side, he starts turning his hips to face me. This is the right response. He wants his hips pointed towards me. And ideally, I want to redirect his hips away from me. So I start moving to one side and I'm steering his hips. He's going to frame with his arms and prevent me from getting past his legs by framing. If he's doing this correctly, as I drive into him, he's actually going to begin circling like this. So I'll go to the other side. I lean, I start driving my shoulder towards his upper body. If he doesn't use some tension, sort of in his lats here where he's bringing his arms downwards, I'm going to be able to easily pass his guard. So I lean into his hands, and if he doesn't keep tension there, I open him up, and I'm able to easily get inside this space. I can do it with my right knee, or I can potentially even do it with my left knee. So the basic idea here is I'm just practicing side-to-side movement. Framing the knees, move to one side. I'm trying to get past his legs. I can't get past, I move to the other side, I start driving into him. He didn't give me tension there, so I'm able to pass his guard.
So Cal, in terms of constraints on the top person,
Yeah.
are you constrained to just using this kind of footwork or other kinds of footwork?
Yeah.
And can you also start redirecting them? Like, is this a Toreando practice or is it just footwork practice?
It's essentially a Toreando practice and footwork. You are specifically framing the knees and working on this portion of the lever to the leg, okay, or to the hip. So you're essentially practicing just your side-to-side movement and then the frames into their knees. We will develop in the next few movements what you were describing. Like we'll be going over leg drags and alternative movements.
Okay, so it is valid to turn here and try to open them up.
Absolutely.
This way.
Yeah. To keep this really simple, again, we just go back to the first video where as long as he's only using frames and I'm only turning those frames into levers and using movement, I have free reign to do whatever it is I want to do to pass his legs. We're just suggesting that the first movement you want to start with is the basic side-to-side movement, and the best response to that essential movement is him keeping his structure and then framing to make sure I don't get to a dominant angle. Okay, so after side-to-side movement, we're going to move into basically moving my opponent side to side. The first way we're going to do that is I'm going to start from the exact same movement we used in the last video. I'm going to move to the side, but I'm really going to focus on leaning into the opposite knee in terms of the direction that I'm moving. So I'm moving to my left, I'm leaning into what is his left knee, my right arm. Okay, so I start moving to the side and I'm really trying to push this leg away. And as I push that leg away, I'm going to move my right knee, in this case, underneath his near side leg and try to settle down into this position here. This is the leg drag position. We're going to follow that up with, as he gives me resistance in trying to pass his guard, so I start trying to move past, he starts pummeling with his legs. So he starts bringing his legs inside exactly, just in a number of different ways. He can basically bring his leg to the outside or the inside. I'm having a hard time controlling his knees. I'm going to move towards his ankles. So rather than controlling the knees, we're now controlling the ankles. And in this scenario, I'm going to look to move into the leg drag again. The leg drag works in a couple of different ways. First of all, I want to move around him, and I also want to move him around me. The basic movement for the leg drag is I move his legs slightly to the side, and I move myself slightly around his legs to move into a position like this. This can be a really effective drill to improve your familiarity with this particular movement. So we started at the knees. I start moving around his guard. I'm able to push that leg away to move into a leg drag position. This is not a full pass, but it is a really strong position to move into to start passing. If he starts pummeling as I'm moving around and I can't control his knees, fine. I go to the ankles and I start looking to move to one side. So there are a number of ways of getting into the leg drag. This next one is probably the most commonly used one. It's probably the best way to practice the leg drag overall. Controlling the ankles, I start moving to one side. Chris has to face me. Okay, if he doesn't, see how he turned his hips? If he doesn't do that, I move to one side. If he doesn't really react, I'll just pass his guard. He has to create a little bit of momentum to face me. So I move, as soon as I recognize he's created momentum, I bring his legs across my body and I squat down into the leg drag position on the other side. So there are a number of ways of getting into the leg drag, and we're trying to tie it into the previous motion, but we also can do it sort of by itself by just controlling the ankles. So the responses I'm gonna commonly get here, really there's one main response, and that's the high leg. Extremely useful movement for the player on the bottom in terms of guard retention. To use the first movement we went over for the bottom player, framing and just keeping your structure tight, and high legs, and full inversions, which we'll go over in a second, that really creates a massive amount of your guard retention movements. If you can get proficient at those select number of things, you can address a variety of different problems. So the high leg is, I start moving his legs to the side for leg drag. He bases on my thigh with this leg, and he brings his other leg across my body to create a frame. So he's creating a new frame. I tried to move his legs out of the way so he couldn't use them as frames, but he ended up putting this foot on me here. So this is a high leg. He uses this to reset his hips, and now he's back to square. Okay, so if I went to the other side, he high legs like this. He can also high leg when I start moving into this side-to-side Toreando type style. So he could use his arms to frame me, and he, more at the shoulder usually, here, and he can supplement that with a high leg with his leg. You'll also notice that as I move into this position, if I'm doing a good job of controlling this ankle, he can't just put his foot directly on me, because this is a pretty solid frame, but he can kick his leg away in a circular motion and bring it up and put it on me to reset his hips. His goal is very much to have his feet in between us. If I am far away from him, so if I'm back here, he doesn't want to extend his legs to frame me because it opens up this space, which gives me an opportunity to pass. But when I am close to him, having the bottom of his feet on me is the most effective frame. It's the strongest mechanism he can use in his body to keep me away from him, and it's also the longest range frame that he can use. To elaborate, finally, the next piece will be, as I begin moving between these two movements we worked on, so moving side to side, moving his legs side to side, he starts high legging, and there will be a situation where I continue to move around him. So I start moving to north-south, and here, he can choose, depending on the scenario, whether he's going to try to reset like he did before, back to square, or I start moving around, he puts his feet on me, he's going to spin the whole way through in the other direction. This is worth spending a moment on. In inverting and moving into positions where your neck is potentially in a vulnerable position, something definitely worth talking about. So if I start moving around Chris, this is a really effective way to practice the high leg and the inversion because he doesn't end up in a very compromised position. So I start moving around, he high legs, and he starts spinning underneath, something like this. Okay, so we can do that over and over if you want to move closer. It's a really good drill to practice where he can put his feet on my chest and he starts spinning around in circles like this. I can help him by moving with him. So I'll move around, okay, and I'll help him work on his full inversion. This is gonna be a great way to do it. The rule of thumb here is, generally speaking, not as a physical professional or a physician, the spine can bend as long as all of the vertebrae are bending at a relatively equal amount. Generally, you'll be okay, right? But if your neck by itself is bending a lot and the rest of your spine has an equal bend, that area where there's an extra, bit of a bend or a curve is where you're going to be susceptible to injury. So you don't want to end up inverting where your neck is crushed into a really compromised position. I've had some neck challenges myself, dealt with basically concussions as a result of poor alignment of the neck. It's a horrible experience. I tend to not allow myself to get into a stack position at all really anymore. And when I do invert, I only invert in this way. I will not invert into a position where my neck is like completely tucked. You're trying to invert where your back is what's in contact with the ground. So if I lift Chris's legs up, his back is in contact with the ground, he can move around quite a bit like this. Chris is pretty mobile, but if he were to get stacked right up onto his neck and his neck was sort of crushed, you do not want to be in this position. You do not want to spend time there. You don't want to practice there, especially if someone you're training with is unable to control themselves and they fall. It's going to be disastrous for your neck and you don't want to be in that position.
So Cal, are you saying that the high leg and the reset and the high leg and the inversion are the only counters to the leg drag guard pass? And similarly, if we go back to technique, that maintaining your frames and tracking your opponent side to side are the only counters to the Toreando style passing?
Absolutely not. So it's kind of like when you're taking a multiple choice test and it says, one of those options is like, it's only this thing.
Yeah.
It's probably not that thing. Because, usually it's a little more complicated than that. So what we're trying to get across here is the bottom player needs to maintain a few things. So in the language of sort of the BJJ concept stuff that you're regularly working with, Rob would say that bottom player needs to maintain their structure. So they're keeping their limbs tight to their body. And if they don't extend their limbs, they're much less vulnerable. Now they're also using frames to prevent me from getting close to them. And they're using their movement to make sure that their hips are pointed towards me. So those are the main criteria that we're trying to work with. The movements that we're showing are really great examples of the application of those concepts to extremely common high-level guard passing movements. So we're giving you an example of something you can do, and frankly, you're going to do it the vast majority of the time, but there are really a ton of different ways you could go about this. So, for example, Chris is on his back. When it comes to really high-level movements, as I start to move, Chris could look to actually sit up. So if he kicks and tries to sit up and just frame me, like let's say he frames my chest. So like I'm here and he wants to just disengage and sits up and frames me and he scoots away. Okay, so in this situation, he was able to create space between us by moving and creating a frame and creating more movement. So I start to move around him. Now the ones we gave it as an example, he frames me, okay? He gets longer range frame, so this is a nice long range frame. And now he's gonna look to reset. So he might put his other frame on me, and now he recomposes his hip angle. So these are really, really good ways of demonstrating those concepts, those sort of principles. But you don't have to follow those specifically. There are certainly scenarios where you can do different things, but really we're covering probably 80% of the most effective techniques to respond to the most effective passes.
So it's an 80-20 analysis.
I would say so, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna spar the previous sort of two sections. Now, this is meant to build, so every section we do after this will build upon this section. This is by far where you want to spend the bulk of your time practicing your guard passing at the very beginning. And really, as you get better, this is the fundamental level. So I can work on my side-to-side passing and my deflection-based passing. So I'm moving myself side to side, I'm moving him side to side. That's basically what's happening here. So we'll go ahead. Chris is only using frames and hip movement, and the movements we went over, and he can improvise, but the movements we went over are gonna be the most effective thing for now. So I'm starting to move around. I encounter frames, I grab the end of the lever, I move them out of the way. I move them out of the way, I'm moving into the leg drag position. He's doing a good job framing, he resets, all good. We move back to the center. Framing his knees, I start moving around, driving into his, maybe I can redirect his arms here. Nice, I got through his frames. He didn't have very strong frames in that scenario. I was able to break them down. Start moving to one side, I redirect, I'm moving to my leg drag, get down into base. I'm trying to keep him from coming up into base. This is a movement we haven't gone over yet, but this would be the response, assuming he doesn't know this response. It's a good example. I'm dealing with a frame, I lean into that frame, okay, I'm gonna disconnect and redirect. I keep pressure on the frame, I disconnect and redirect the frame downwards. I'm able to get past his hips. Framing, moving around, redirecting, moving around. I can move all the way in a circle. Okay, I can move all the way in a circle, like put pressure onto his knees. I can move into this bit. All right, we'll do one more. We're gonna move directly into a leg drag. I move to the side, right into a leg drag. I try to drop down. He's able to high leg, I redirect again. I'm able to get past.
So at the risk of asking something obvious, this is obviously a benefit to you, but it's also a benefit to him because he's getting to drill his movements.
Huge question for sure. So it's really hard to coach out of context, especially for beginners. What you'll find is when you start training, if you're relatively new or if you're experienced in your coaching, if you're trying to show a defensive, like a response to a poor attack, you're really not spending your time on something effective, right? So when you teach offense and defense at the same time, both players are getting good at dealing with responses and movements they'll see from high-level competitors or high-level players, right? As opposed to letting people play around and develop their own movements, that kind of thing. This is definitely a much better way of practicing what actually works rather than developing movements that are responses to things that aren't very high level. You know, A lot of people go through the experience in jiu-jitsu of they get up to maybe like a blue belt level or maybe nearly a blue belt level, and they're dealing with someone who's brand new to the gym. And
so they get really good at beating up white belts.
Well, they may, but this is my point though. It's actually kind of a little bit different. rather than getting good at beating white belts, they're getting good at beating people who fit within the predictable movements, right? Like they're practicing what works in jiu-jitsu, but they aren't really familiar with how to deal with someone who's come off the street and they give them a bunch of unpredictable stuff, right? So that can be a challenge generally. But with that said, by practicing what is effective, by the time they get very proficient with those movements, they're not going to have a problem with those unpredictable options because they're not very high level. So there's always an opening somewhere when someone's not doing something that doesn't sort of fit into what works at the high level, essentially, if that makes sense.
Okay, so it's more like the guy who's getting fairly decent and then escaping the traditional jiu-jitsu pins, but then somebody comes in and just grabs a headlock for dear life, and they don't know what to do because it isn't a jiu-jitsu move.
They don't know what to do. They haven't practiced it before. And there is a certain point, I think, in your jiu-jitsu journey where you're like, oh man, like the stuff that I've been doing, it's not working on this beginner. It's like, well, actually, there's such a simple response to what that beginner is doing that I can just show you that really simple response. But because there's such a simple response, we don't want to spend a lot of time developing skill in that area.
So here you're developing, this is a different focus here. You're developing skill against a skilled movement.
Exactly.
And developing intelligent responses to intelligent responses.
Exactly.